west, but cloudy in the northeast. They hypothesized that since vitamin D production is the most important physiological effect of sunlight, that vitamin D likely reduced the risk of colon cancer. It took 6 years to get this hypothesis published, since many journals rejected the hypothesis. It was published in a journal in the UK, the International Journal of Cancer. And then reprinted 25 years later with commentaries by people in the field pointing out it was definitely a landmark paper. They followed that up by showing that oral vitamin D intake was associated with a reduced risk of colon cancer, and that higher blood levels of vitamin D were as well. They also showed that breast and ovarian cancer had a similar geographical variation to colon cancer, and that UVB reduced the risk. Dr. Garland has continued his research in vitamin D and cancer. He has 48 published papers on vitamin D and cancer listed at PubMed, and I'm a co-author on 23 of these. I appreciate working with him. So, without further ado, Dr. Garland.
Thank you, Bill. Great pleasure to be here. I've always, since I was a kid, I dreamed of speaking at the Commonwealth Club. From hearing it on the radio and hearing this gavel, it just is indicative of being in a wonderful place here in San Francisco at this club and being with all of you today. Is there anyone in the audience who's from Marin County? Anyone here from Marin County? Sausalito? There is one person here from Marin County. Good. And is there anyone here that's kind of interested in bringing down the rates of breast cancer? Is there quite a few of you have an active interest in that? Well, good. Well, what I'd like to do is tell you the story of how I got involved in this practically as a child, and how it's occupied the last 35 years of my life, and what we found at the behest of the government as part of the war on cancer, and what we could do that we're not doing to end breast cancer. And as I was preparing the talk, the National Breast Cancer Coalition asked President Bill Clinton, former President Clinton, to end breast cancer by 2020, and he's such an agreeable guy, he said, I'll do it. And so now he's become the chairman of the committee to end breast cancer by 2020. Whether he will use the tools that are needed to achieve this seemingly impossible objective is going to be up to him, and maybe to some of us, or anyone who seems to want to get involved in it, because only a few people are. It's a small cadre of important promoters of the field. This lecture is dedicated to one of them, my brother, Dr. Frank Garland, whom we lost in 2010. I want to thank people that have helped with this presentation and work on cancer in general. So the question is, how do we achieve a quick end to breast cancer? And in 1974, scientists were asked to help, and I happened to be there at the moment that scientists were asked to help. I was at Johns Hopkins, and a gentleman, Robert M. Hoover from the National Cancer Institute, had having been put over a barrel by President Nixon at the behest of a woman named Mary Lasker, said, we're going to fight a war on cancer. This is it. This is my legacy. Turned out not so well for him, he got involved in other things, but he did launch this war on cancer. And one thing that happens when you launch a war is that you've got to have some generals, and generals want one thing, they want maps. We need to have maps. They need to define the territory, they need to define the topography, they need to show where the enemy units are, and the more detailed the maps, the better. Any of you who've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, the one with the father in it, when they get in a fireplace and the fireplace rotates around, and they're looking in at the very inner sanctum of the control of the Third Reich. There it is in the middle of this room, this great huge map. And people have sticks and are moving military units around. And so that's what the war on cancer gave us. And this gentleman showed me and a few colleagues the first maps that resulted from the 3,056 counties who reported death from breast cancer in the United States. And he was glad to be done with it, as I recall. But that was the charge, and I know the exact date it happened. It was in July of 1974. It was a hot room, the air conditioning was broken. In Baltimore, we were all sweating and could barely stand to get through the presentation. But at the time, he said, so why don't you guys go for this? See if you can do anything about it. And people shrugged and eyes glazed over. But my brother and I took it really seriously. We had just arrived. We'd just gotten out of our old Mustang and driven across America. We thought, we're going to do this thing. And so we found the cause. It was back in 1990 of breast cancer. and a simple means of preventing the disease, but no one has acted on it. And we didn't know it at the time, but there had been another person, Apperly, that had thought that at least sunlight was involved in preventing cancer. And someone else had thought that skin cancer was antagonistic to cancer, Heller, and unbeknownst to us. But we were pretty excited about what we found. As Dr. Grant told you, it was extremely difficult to get it published. After 6 years, we finally did. But even though it got published, and even though there have since been, there are 893 publications as of last night that are not editorials, comments, news, or reviews on vitamin D and breast cancer. It blew my mind when I saw it. No one has acted on it yet. Nobody's really seriously taking vitamin D, which is what I'll be talking about today, as you might surmise from the title, to prevent cancer. Rescue action would be easy, but since we're not taking it, needless cases of deaths continue, largely unabated, hence the black tie. So it all started, in a way, this energy or this idea that science could conquer bad stuff or could do amazing things with Sputnik. And I remember as a kid, 11 years old, I saw it go by. We needed binoculars and everybody was out in the street and it was quite exciting. And then you could hear beep, 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 beep. It had a Morse code transmitter on it that any kid could tune in that had the industry to do it. And my brother and I listened to that and we were quite taken with it. I'm going to show you the theory that developed from it. We're going to go back to it, but I just wanted to plant it in your mind first so that we can allude to it later and get into greater depth on it. But this, listening to that Sputnik and collecting epidemiological data led us to this conclusion that there's an evolutionary theory of breast cancer and that it has a new stage not previously considered part of cancer. Up until now, we've only had initiation and promotion. But what we learned from the research I'm going to present to you now is that there's a preceding step that's the most important one, and it's decoupling. I take this type of spelling from Michael Hollick, but it wasn't his thought. And it's loss of tight junctions due to low vitamin D. And one thing that happens in your poor body is if your vitamin D level is low, as it is, as Dr. Cannell described, because we're wearing so much clothing, we've got sunscreens on, we're paranoid about the sun, we don't have the vitamin D. Our cells are not as tightly connected to one another, and that leads to a host of diseases because the cells are able to compete rather than cooperate, and that leads to natural selection, competition for growth and aggression. And you'll note it says here that breast cancer is not mainly due to carcinogens, and I will digress for just a moment to tell you that I often get called upon to advise people, like in Cape Cod, about why they have so much breast cancer in Cape Cod, or Nassau County, New York, or any semi-foggy place. And I go out or I talk to them and they say, well, we found a gas station. We're going to dig up the gas station and the breast cancer is coming from that gas station or that cranberry bog or that field. And I'm thinking, come on, guys, you're in the midst of a region where everybody has a huge amount of breast cancer. It's unlikely that that gas station is going to account for it. But that's what people do. People say we always are trying to fight the last war. That's true of this. We're looking for carcinogens. And we don't have an occupational pattern of breast cancer that suggests that there's any role for carcinogens. When you have a chemical carcinogen, you see the people that work with the chemicals, and in the course of life, people have to industrially work with chemicals, and they are the people who have high rates. And that's not true of breast cancer. It happens in all of us, all females, mainly some men. Well, then the driver of almost all biological activity is evolution, natural selection. Some of our cells, due to infidelity or reproduction of the DNA, turn out to be more competitive than others. They reproduce faster, they consume much of their neighbors. There's a bunch of things they do that constitutes cancer. And so we'll come back to this, but this is the result of all that. But the energy for it is very similar to that, although it hasn't yet been harvested as energy, that was inspired by JFK after Sputnik. And you can see the quote here, we chose to go to the moon, we chose to go to the moon in this decade, so he's saying we're going to do it right away. And not because these things are easy, but because they are hard, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, which we should be willing to do for breast cancer if we're willing to spend all that time and energy to go to the moon, one we're unwilling to postpone and one which we intend to win. Or as Carol Baggerly said at a great meeting that I was present at National Cancer Institute or the National Cancer Institute, the National Center, where is your sense of urgency? And researchers have been doing that. We've been studying breast cancer for 100 years with no sense of urgency. If we could just get a little of that sense of urgency, we might make a little progress. Sometimes things pop up in the media. The most recent example is Angelina Jolie and her double mastectomy, which took 8 hours to do. It was a more grueling procedure than you would imagine. Most of us think, oh, well, just a cosmetic procedure. It's a form of tummy tuck. But the reality is that you really have to get out all the breast tissue and it's stuck to the chest wall. And there's a lot of work involved in getting all that tissue out, so it's not an easy thing. And someone said, well, why don't you get your ovaries out at the same time? And she said, are you kidding? That's even more involved in a way, although it's more common. But it's brought this question of what causes breast cancer a little bit to the fore. So I'm going to give you a talk that's going to be divided into 3 parts, as all Gall was. The problem is the first part. Then we'll talk about the solution, which we know the solution, and then finally actions needed in order to actually prevent the breast cancer if we are going to act on the charge given to former President Clinton and get rid of this disease by 2020, which is completely possible. Here's the problem. Normally we have, well, as you know, the breast is a specialized sweat gland, but also wonderfully specialized so that it can make milk. And it moves calcium and fat and sugar into the ducts. The ducts are the answer. And this is D-U-C-T. It's not with a K, but the ducts, these big ducts that ultimately conduct the milk from the places where it's made, the little sacs where it's made, and a million of them in the breast, to the ducts, and then from the ducts through several ducts to the nipple, and then out into the mouth of the baby. That's how it's made. It's how it's been designed to do. But sometimes what's supposed to be a duct, and you can see in this picture, I don't know if we have a pointer, so I might have to, it looks like there might be a pointer here. Well, if not, I'll just point it out to you. But you'll have to bear with me for a moment because I've got to get this microphone down. This is a duct. It normally should be open as a reservoir for the milk. And your body secretes the milk into that reservoir. And then it's surrounded by these muscle cells called the myoepithelial cells. And when the baby comes to the nipple, these squeeze down, these myoepithelial cells, and the milk squirts out. It goes into the ducts and squirts into the mouth of the baby. And then the baby will have enough calcium and vitamin D, mainly calcium, it's not so good for vitamin D, and protein to become a baby and have a skeleton so that you can hold the baby up and have it smile back at you, which you couldn't do if you didn't give it all this calcium and the other things that this gland is uniquely secreting among all the glands and organs in your body. So it all starts in the terminal unit. And the terminal unit, you see, is this hollow object at the top. And then the hollow object is supposed to stay hollow, but in the presence of, when there's not enough vitamin D around, it starts to get full of cells. And I've seen professors from other universities, particularly like in Maine, they say, this is the normal duct. But in Southern California or out in Arizona, that's the normal duct. And it's even regarded as normal, although it's pathological. And ultimately, the women come up dry as a result of it, because there's so many cells in the duct that there's no reservoir for the milk, and you can't feed the baby, and the lactation gets goofed up by it. But worse than that, these cells become a competing population, competing for limited resources in an aggressive environment, and once they do, they get so nasty and create so much pressure in this duct that they get out of the duct, and then they can sneak around the body, get carried by the lymphatic circulation to the brain or the liver, a variety of places where they will eventually kill the woman needlessly if we had just kept the duct looking like this rather than producing these situations where natural selection, competition, and aggression lead to the development of an aggressive clone or clones that get out of the tissue and into the circulation. So if you can just bear this in mind, that cancer arises in the terminal units. We didn't used to know why before the war on cancer. We just knew that it was true. And just very even simpler, once in a while, it'll come out of the duct itself, but usually it is from these circular objects that I just showed you. And I described this to a physicist recently, and he said, well, I call this the spherical cow theory of breast cancer. And I'd never heard it before, but I'd heard that if you're trying to visualize something and you want to, like how a cow might behave with respect to the environment. First, you visualize the cow as a sphere. And if you could just imagine it with the little horns coming out and the hose, and some artists have reproduced this, I guess, former physics students. And so I was kind of glad to hear that it fit into a context. So think of it for the moment as a spherical cow theory. And I'm going to show you a little more about it. Now, unfortunately, this spherical cow thing kills, about 500,000 people a year. And in the U.S., there's 230,000 cases, about 40,000 people die of it. And there's a lot more of it in areas where there's not much solar ultraviolet B radiance. So this isn't my brother and me, but we looked roughly like that at the time, except for maybe a little more hair. So we felt that we were the people that were assigned this job by the president through Robert N. Hoover of the NCI to get rid of the disease. So naturally, we looked at the maps, and this is what we found. Areas that had not too much sunlight, like the upper right, the northeastern part of the United States, that's where the breast cancer was coming down hot and heavy. There's mortality from it. But shockingly for us, Arizona, New Mexico, through which we had just driven and sweltered through the heat there in July of 1974, were relatively free of it. The blue means lower rates than usual, and the white means average rates. And there just weren't even in the conurbations, if you want to use such a term, but the cities of the South, there just wasn't much, particularly Arizona, New Mexico, where we have 500 calories a day of sunlight. There wasn't much breast cancer. But there sure was in the Northeast. Well, people bought and poo-pooed and said, well, obviously your theory is wrong because look at Los Angeles. And what about the Bay Area? They have high rates. And our explanation was, and to this day, I believe it, although I'm willing to listen to other explanations, we think those are magnet areas where people who were not born there went there from the areas that were high. And very often, I used to do this, I won't do it today, but ask around a room how many people are actually native or actually born here. And usually it's a minority of hands, and we find that quite a few people in most of those informal surveys are from the Northeast. There are, of course, formal surveys of this that show about the same thing. So we concluded at the moment we saw this, which was on that hot July day, having the experience that we did, sunlight suppresses breast cancer for whatever reason, and cancer of the colon. I won't go into that now because, as they say, that is another story. But it's just as well proven in a recent study of 500,000 participants. I hate to think of the hairs lost during that study. Found that, yes, it does. Vitamin D prevents colon cancer, but we won't go into that. Now, you may have wondered why it was so much worse in the northeastern quadrant of the United States. And there are a bunch of theories about it, but the one that I think is the best one is that there's just too much acid haze there, which is a precursor of acid rain. It's a ammonium nitrate compound that lives in the atmosphere, and you don't hear about it much except when something strange happens, like when JFK Jr. went down off of Martha's Vineyard because he lost his orientation due to being unable to see the stars and the lighthouses and buildings on the ground, and he spiraled into the sea. There was some other doctors that happened that were up flying that night and reported the same thing. It's from about 4,000 to 8,000 feet, and it exists above the northeastern part of the United States due to the burning of high sulfur coal, mainly from Pennsylvania and Ohio. It's a cheap form of coal that produces a huge amount of pollution. We know it because it also acidifies the water bodies, and that's one way of measuring it, although there are other ways. So you can also look at breast cancer by latitude in the world, and at first it looks like, oh, this is just a random pattern. But if you look at it a little more thoroughly, what you'll see is that places to the north in the northern hemisphere, or the south in the southern hemisphere, like New Zealand, that's a great example, it's very high rates of breast cancer, have high rates. And places like, well, who knows what this is? What country is that? Iceland. Oh, by itself, Iceland. Iceland usually is way near the top in breast cancer rates. And there are several European countries that are at high latitudes too, they've got high rates, and we do, and so does Canada. Although in the United States, it's mostly the northern half that's got it. And then when you get near the equator, you're seeing those green rates. Instead of it being 100 like it is in New Zealand, it's maybe 19 or 20 in places like Costa Rica or sub-Saharan Africa. And so, well, at first it doesn't look like it has a pattern. On careful scrutiny, I think you might agree with me that there is a latitudinal distribution of this disease. Which brings us to our Mr. Sun, and this was the movie that inspired Frank Garland and I when we were kids to be interested in the sun. It told all about how the rays of the sun contain UVA and UVB, and I guess we just never forgot about it, and it eventuated us in the development of decoupling theory. Well, I've been through most of it with you, but I'll take another step or two before we go on to the next topic. Once this natural selection occurs, and we're modeling it now as a computer model, it's kind of amazing. Only a 2% advantage in growth in 9,000 generations will lead to completely taking over the spherical cow, terminal ductal lobular unit. Very tiny differences in the rate of reproduction lead to the clone completely taking over. So it's very easy for cancer to take over just on the basis of some cells reproducing more rapidly than others. Does not require carcinogens to do that. It's just that there's some infidelity of reproduction that leads to variation. Variation is capitalized on by natural selection. And even without exposure to a carcinogen, we'll end up with a breast cancer. So my thought here is, please, let's stop looking for the carcinogen. It'll drive us nuts and we'll be going down a false trail. The overgrowth, it's good to prevent that, and if we give vitamin D, the cells stick together and they don't overgrow. They even have a hard time getting out of the original sphere in which they were created. Metastasis, well, we all know what that's about, and spread to distant places. And usually not included in cancer models, but we included is that if there's a lot of vitamin D present, there will be a phenomenon of involution, where the cancer shrinks and then it can transit to scar. And breasts have, in the US, breasts have a lot of scar in them. Little tiny scars spread throughout the breast, suggesting that cancers have started on many occasions in most women, and they've been turned into scar. And that's probably the normal natural history of breast cancer, is it autonomously turns to scar, which carries some hope. This is just a little more of the description of how you have now see, this is called a normal ductal lumen. That would be normal in Iceland or maybe Maine. It would only be a single layer of epithelial cells in a sunny place. And then you see the benign proliferation. The crowd is building, not yet fighting for limited resources. And then finally, you've got ductal carcinoma in situ, where the fight is going on. The cells that are most rapidly reproducing are taking over. And at that point, they're actually eating the adjacent cells. And one cell eats about one, we found from the modeling, it appears that one cell eats one other cell a day. So there's an aggressor cell, the Tyrannosaurus rex, if you like, and then the brontosaurus or some other poor cell nearby that isn't quite as aggressive and gets eaten. And that really speeds up the rate of evolution of the cancer. Cancer that is already growing fast and then consumes one other cell a day can take over in less than half the amount of time in the mathematical modeling. So where are we with breast cancer? I'm an epidemiologist, so I can't help but tell you about rates. We're not doing so great with it. These are new breast cancer cases in women 50 and older in the US, and this is about what it does. It kind of goes up, it kind of goes down. The down is when, here, we took away the estrogen. We did the Women's Health Initiative. Turned out women were dying of breast cancer, they were dying of blood clots. So then an edict was issued saying, hey, don't give them so much estrogen. And that helps a little. You know, it says randomized trial results announced. Doesn't make a big difference, but it takes the edge off it. But it's climbing up again to where it was before. This is another way of looking at it, the incidence rates. This is stratified by age, and you see we're not having much luck with it. The people are 50 and older, that's the postmenopausal breast cancer. And if you look at the bottom, the premenopausal, we're not doing much either, although you will hear the voluntary agencies telling you, oh, we're making great progress against breast cancer. As I see it, it's somewhat minimal. You can do it by age groups, and this one is for people 70 to 79. This is the changes over time, and this one's for people 80 and older. It just seems to be under any kind of epidemiological scrutiny wrong to conclude that we have breast cancer on the run. Another way of looking at it, this is in situ versus invasive, and it's good. It's perking along for invasive, and it's doing the same for in situ. So what we're going to talk about a little more is what vitamin D does, and when it gets low, these normally empty ducts fill up. And that's when the battle royal begins, and that battle royal leads to cancer. And there's nothing we can do in the environment that's going to stop that, except for one thing. And pretty soon, with low vitamin D, not only that, but you've got the invasion that we talked about earlier, because these cells are not adherent to one another, so they're easily knocked off and enter the lymphatic circulation and go to elsewhere in the body where they kill the person. A tiny bit of this is due to increases in cloudiness. We've modeled the incidence of breast cancer in the world, and these investigators have too, and come to about the same conclusion that, oddly enough, the cloudier a place is, the more breast cancer. You know, you're told since childhood, well, you know, you got to wear the sunscreens even when it's cloudy because the ultraviolet energy penetrates the clouds. Well, if they are high cirrus clouds, that's true. But if they're scud, if they're, you know, the stratus clouds that we have near the coast, those block ultraviolet. And as we release more particulates into the atmosphere, we put more condensation nuclei that lead to more clouds. The more clouds we have, the more breast cancer we're going to see unless we do something about it. Well, everybody has to wonder, is it hereditary? And for almost all diseases which have been established as deficiency diseases, whether it's pellagra, which is due to deficiency of niacin, or scurvy, which is due to a deficiency of vitamin C, or, well, you know, pick your example, rickets, which is due to a deficiency of vitamin D, beriberi, which is due to a thiamine deficiency. Everybody always says it's hereditary. Forget about it. Forget about it. It's hereditary, and we can't do anything about it, so just get used to it. And you kind of wonder, you know, so many factors are hereditary. This is Jolie with her mother, Marceline, whom she lost just recently to an undisclosed type of cancer. There probably are cancer families. It's estimated that about 5% of cancer of the breast is due to hereditary factors such as the BRCA genes. But 9 out of 10 breast cancers occur in isolation, namely without a first-degree relative who has the disease. And that's about what you might expect on the basis of it being such a common disease. So there really isn't much epidemiological evidence that breast cancer is very hereditary, unless you, like Jolie, happen to be in a cancer family. Well, we're always told mammography is the answer, and I remember a television program that Dr. Sanjeev Gupta held with all the female news anchors, people whom I admire, Jessica Savage and Barbara Walters and all these other people, and they had this big long table, and they spent an hour discussing breast cancer. What are we going to do about breast cancer? And finally, at the end, Sanjay said, well, ladies, what should we do? And they all, to a woman, said, get a mammogram. Get out and get your mammogram. They were of a single voice on it. Well, how much do mammograms help? This is a graph made by one of the mammogram companies, and there's big money in mammograms, so they can afford to make all the graphs in the world, and this is one that they've made and promulgated. And so this isn't going to be understating the effect of mammograms, it's just going to be trying to state it, you know, in a way that's beneficial to them. But we'll look at one just as an example. Like this blue one is people from 70 to 79. And here's the mortality, you know, it's way too high. Knocking around, you know, we're capable of being down at like 20, but here we are way up here. And then screening is introduced. And so, you know, it continued to go up for a while. Here's the screening point. But then it kind of did catch on. It looks like it did go down just a tad. And although this was at about the time we were also decreasing estrogen. But what Seaman says is that it would have gone up like that, even more steeply, had there not been mammograms. But when you look at it as a public health professional, or just as a citizen, you think, well, you know, okay, that's pretty good, but hey, the real issue is the point, how far this is above zero. In fact, this starts at 40. Not so much how far below this is of what it might have been. Because what this means is if we gave everybody mammography, 97% of American women have had it, we're not going to make any big difference in the distance between zero, not even shown here, and this line. So, you know, I sympathize with the news anchors because there wasn't much else they could say, but what they were saying was, you know, ultimately, of almost no help. Mammography is, you know, it's really a pretty borderline thing to even do. So, at any rate, so those are the supposedly big answers. At least that's what all the news anchors thought, and Sanjay agreed, get that awareness up, get those women out, get them getting mammograms. Well, it's hardly gonna, it's a drop in the bucket in terms of an effect. But we really studied this thing to death, breast cancer, vitamin D. There are ecological studies, Dr. William Grant has done many of them, case control studies, groups at Harvard and at the German Cancer Research Center and all over the place have done them. Wonderful studies also from Joe Benucci and Harvard colleagues on cohorts of women like the Nurses' Health Study that have found the effect. Other cohort studies over 20-year periods. We've done a meta-analysis, 2 other people have done them. And we would have a randomized controlled clinical trial where women were given 1,000 units of vitamin D. And I'll show you the effects of the results for that as we get a little closer to the solution. So the solution is not something new. Some people say there's nothing new under the sun. Maybe it's an apt statement, considering what we're talking about. Even Hippocrates himself, the father of Western medicine, said if you have a choice of where you're going to buy your house, it's location, location, location. It should be on the side of the hill that gets the sun. And in our hemisphere, that's the south side. We live in the southern hemisphere. Of course, you would want to be on the north side. And because that's what gets sun all day. And so Hippocrates was on to something, to kind of put it in maybe needlessly simple terms. But he was full of good advice. So Sharif Moore and his colleagues, a member of our group, decided to make what we call some people call this a graph of age-adjusted breast cancer incidence by latitude. But given the way they look, we call them a smiler. Because whenever there's an association between vitamin D and a disease, rather than being a flat line, which would be the so-called null hypothesis, there will be a smile. And this smile looks like, haven't I seen that curve before? Is it Humpty Dumpty in the egg? But what it is it's 1 divided by the cosine of the latitude. And it turns out that the amount of energy received on a spherical surface, whether a spherical cow or the somewhat spherical Earth, is proportional to the inverse of the cosine of the latitude. So we know from this line here, which the computer drew, not knowing that was the secret, it just drew a line that most closely approximated the points, that you could draw that same line by taking 1 divided by the cosine of latitude, which is the measure of the strength of the energy coming from the sun. Well, our star patient up here, star pupil is New Zealand. Remember, it's way down there near the equator. And man, New Zealand is almost everything we've ever studied in the epidemiology of vitamin D-related diseases. New Zealand is right up there pitching, usually at the top in the southern hemisphere. And in the northern hemisphere, what do we got? We have Iceland. Iceland's very reliable, although once in a great while it won't be quite as high as you might think, but generally you can count on it. The others you can count on are pretty much those northern countries like Norway. And we're out of sight. USA has the highest rate, probably due to our mammography programs. Israel has a lot of Ashkenazi Jews that have a bad gene we think a gene for vitamin D management, and it gets them up higher than they should be. In fact, a kind of a parlor activity of vitamin D epidemiologists is to look at these 174 countries and try to figure out why New Zealand is above the line and why Mozambique is below it. And it isn't just reporting. These reports are all certified by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, but we believe these really are the differences. And that's the smiling. But using methods similar to those that Bill Grant uses, and I think he's a co-author on these, we looked at the different components of what causes breast cancer. And usually when we do these analyses, the most powerful one that comes out is solar UVB irradiance. But you can put in per capita alcohol consumption, and it's bad too. And it's just not as strong an association. The proportion of women that are overweight, well, it has a little bit of a bad effect too, but not so strong. Cigarettes, that didn't do much. You can see the p-value in the last column. And if it's less than 0.05, it wasn't significant. So solar UVB irradiance was. Fertility, that one was significant. And per capita health expenditure, maybe some people would say, well, you see it more where you have more money or you don't detect it as readily, what have you. It wasn't important. So we did not account for type of clothing worn. And as you might imagine, in some countries, the practice of purdah, what have you, it really deprives women of vitamin D. It's all coming from their hands, and they often have tattoos on their hands that aren't so good for that either. Well, the next step, we decided to do the meta-analysis, and this is what we found. I'm going to go through it quickly. The main point is at the bottom, the diamond at the bottom, showing if you take all studies of this that have been done, the combined relative risk is 0.63, which means taking all studies together, you have about 40% lower risk of breast cancer if you're in the top category of vitamin D. And we could spend longer on it, but I'm not going to. And it kind of, the vitamin D level goes, as vitamin D level goes up in the serum, in the range that we have from existing studies, you'll see there's largely a drop in the vitamin D. And if you look at individual studies, you don't see it going up, it just keeps going down. This is a study that we just completed looking at the serum 25-OHD, which is the best measure of your serum vitamin D status along the horizontal axis, and the odds ratio for breast cancer during the 90 days preceding diagnosis. And those are the green dots. And there you see the kind of relationship we see for colon cancer. It's usually, it's almost like mathematical. It's like Leibniz with a family. Well, I told you about the randomized control trial. Amazingly, in the 30 or so years that I've been talking about this, there's always someone in the audience that says, well, I will not believe it until there's a randomized controlled clinical trial. I just will not believe it. They'll put their foot down, they'll stomp, they'll do whatever. Well, it just so happens that there is one, and done by Joan Lappy and her colleagues at Creighton University. And I'm not going to go into the great details of it, but it's a beautifully designed clinical trial. And what they found was, and this takes a little explanation, women that had just the placebo, the pills were sugar, they had about let's call it a 5% incidence or 6% incidence of cancer. And then women that took calcium, I'm subtracting from 1, they had about a 3% incidence of cancer. And women that took calcium and vitamin D, they only had a 1% incidence of cancer. Relative risk was 0.23. That means that the women that took the vitamin D had only a fifth the incidence of cancer. And that included breast cancer and colon cancer, even lung cancer. And yet people say, well, I don't believe that there is a clinical trial. And I've been told that right straight to my face. And it just ain't so. It just is not true. We have a clinical trial. Now the question is, do we need 40 of them? Or do we, how many do we need? Well, since we already have 893 studies, approximately, I'm guessing that we probably just need one clinical trial to put the bow on the top. Because the clinical trial only does one thing that all the other studies can't do, and that is to rule out the possibility of the effect being solely due to confounding beyond that which can be controlled for with multiple regression. And you only need one, actually, to rule out that alternative explanation. So it's been done. We've done it. And science has answered the challenge of figuring out what the cause of breast cancer is. And just by accident, colon cancer and even lung cancer, and these were mainly non-smoking women. It might not have worked quite as well, obviously, if they were smokers. But it's been done. If you get rid of 80% of something, you've made a big dent in it, it would seem to me. Well, at any rate, how does it work? This question often comes up. There are the skeptics among us that always want to know how it works. And it's not too complicated for premenopausal breast cancer. As far as we see it, what happens is that the cancer evolved using the dynamite model, and then toward the tail end of it, it recruits blood vessels. If it recruits blood vessels, it can grow and grow and grow and grow, and then eventually spread and kill it. But vitamin D prevents the recruitment of blood vessels, so you don't get this big, see that great big guy there, this one here? This is because it has recruited blood, and it's growing and growing and growing and growing, and it's a specific effect of vitamin D that prevents the recruitment of blood vessels. Credit for this goes to Judith Volkman of the Harvard Cancer Center, who for years knew that the recruitment of blood vessels was important, although he never knew until he recently died that it was due to vitamin D. We've seen that one. So let's go ahead. So it inhibits angiogenesis. These references are all available online. Induces apoptosis. It makes the cells die when they're supposed to die, and they're programmed to do so. It inhibits proliferation, promotes differentiation. by upregulation of E-cadherin, we believe, which is a glue that makes the cells stick together, and upregulating the structures that makes the cells stick together, or the tight junction. This is what these look like. You remember from high school, if you looked at a paramecium, it had a lot of cilia sticking out of it. Specialized cilia still exist in human cells, but now, rather than for swimming, they're used to squeeze the cells together and to keep them from proliferating needlessly. So let's go on a little bit more. Toxicity is always a question every time we discuss this with people in terms of taking action. Well, what about perhaps what about the toxicity? Well, this is from Ryan Reed. And what happens is that until you get up to 10,000 IU, these black dots are no toxicity. You don't have any toxicity, so I don't know why people are always saying, oh yeah, I'm worried about that 4,000 IU a day. It just isn't there. Now when you get up really high, then you begin to see it. The standard repletion dose, which is sometimes needed for cancer patients, does risk a little toxicity. That's usually hypercalcemia, but that's only used for a short period of time typically. So we really are safe in this whole range, up to 10,000 IU per day, without batting an eye, and pretty safe above it if needed, such as 50,000 IU. So we could do it in San Francisco, we could do it in Oakland, we could do it in Sausalito, but just raise the level and we'll save the lives. So let's just take a quick look too at hazard of death in women who already have the breast cancer. Now for almost every deficiency disease, in fact all the deficiency diseases that I mentioned to you, the stuff that prevents the disease also treats the disease. And it seems like that's probably true for breast cancer. This is not a clinical trial, but it is a follow-up according to the serum level of vitamin D. And if it's greater than 20, there was, just almost, 42% lower death in women that had vitamin D at that level, and 30 isn't particularly high. It would be interesting to see what it would be as if it were 40 to 60. I think we'd see it was even less mortality. So if you know anyone who has breast cancer and is not receiving vitamin D, tell them to get another doctor. These are more studies that we've talked about of the total huge number of studies that are out there. And we've seen this, so we'll go on and pass it. These are more pooled odds ratios. Another thing you can look at, we just finished looking at this in a paper, not yet published, but there are 32 studies now. Well, what if you take vitamin D and you don't get breast cancer, but hey, maybe you're going to die of something else. Maybe you get heart disease. People are always coming up with these grand theories that you're going to die of something else. Well, the reality is not that way. And this dot is for people who don't have enough vitamin D, they're below average, and they have 1.5 times the all-cause mortality. And these are for younger people, I call them less than 65, or some of the older folks greater than or equal to 65. It's the strongest effect under 65. But overall, you have 1.8 higher chance of death if you're low on the spectrum of vitamin D rather than high. So there's no credibility to the argument that there's anything that vitamin D does to you, nothing that kills you certainly, that's going to carry any weight against taking rather large amounts of vitamin D, like 4,000 or even 10,000 a day. Oddly enough, this is another study we have in the pipeline. It even seems to prevent asthma. And here we have, we find that people that are the lowest quartile on vitamin D have 3.3 times the risk of developing what's called intrinsic asthma. This is the asthma that's not just hay fever, but the kind that comes when people exercise or get a bad cold. And a third of the kids in schools in San Diego have it. This is colorectal cancer. This is among patients with colorectal cancer. And what this is telling us is that among patients with colorectal cancer, you have a 46% lower chance of death if you're in the highest quartile of vitamin D than in the lowest. So not only is it people with breast cancer whose lives could be saved in huge numbers just by giving them vitamin D during their treatment, it's also true for colorectal cancer. And another thing we're working on right at the moment is pancreatic cancer, and the pattern is very similar. It's the smiler. Once in a great while, we'll crank a disease into the computer, and it'll come out as a straight line, and we're kind of dour, around the office, because it doesn't happen very often, but it is capable of happening. So So just so you know, it's just not inherent in the calculation. It's just something that happens. And these are the studies of risk pancreatic cancer. It's been somewhat more controversial than the other ones because there's one author, Stolzenberg Solomon, who's done 3 studies who find an adverse effect is shown on the right side of this dotted line. But the really big studies, including the Harvard cohorts, Wolfman et al., find a benefit. So we think that pancreatic cancer is prevented by vitamin D, but unfortunately there are probably some supplies of cod liver oil and herring that have been contaminated with chlorinated hydrocarbons, which are specific carcinogens for the pancreas. And that if you eat a huge vast amount of herring or consume a huge vast amount of cod liver oil, that you'll end up with that. So we don't want to do that. It's better to have vitamin D, just pure vitamin D. So here we go again. If we can stop that ductal lobular unit from filling up, then we're not going to see breast cancer. So what's the action? Well, now that the coalition has asked the former president to do it, he's got to abandon. Mammography is the answer. Another one to abandon is weak estrogen agonists. Some of the biggest donors to the voluntary agencies that are designated to fight cancer are, well, the 2 top ones are Siemens and General Electric, because I think it's because they make the mammography machines. But the next biggest are the companies that make the so-called weak estrogen agonists. Sounds like agony, and I think it is, because you have to take them because they block your estrogen receptors, and then you get an artificial menopause early. And unfortunately, it also causes blood clots, and I don't think it would be my top choice, certainly. In fact, it would be near the bottom of my list. Breast self-exam, it's been tested in a randomized controlled clinical trial, found to be ineffective. It does nothing. By the time you can feel it in your breast, it's too big. Chances are it's already spread. And even physician breast exam, you don't go to the doctor that often. Doctor's busy, and by the time he feels it, it's too big. It's already spread. MRI is better than a mammogram. There's been talk about using metformin, which is a diabetes drug, but then recent work came out in animals showing that it produces a form of dementia. And so that people aren't going to be lining up, I don't think, for metformin, at least I hope not. So we need to forget about all these silly things that we're doing. We need a new plan of action. Forget the mammography, these things that we talked about. These methods are just not effective. Let's call it quits. About 900 studies is enough, about 80% are positive. There's some null studies, but epidemiology is rather like climbing Mount Everest. Once you've climbed it, you've climbed it. And people come along and say, oh, there's just clouds up there, there's no mountain. You can do another study. It doesn't find what you found, but once you found it, you found it. It's the nature of epidemiology that it isn't reversed by someone failing to find it. And that's often what happens. The latest day comes along and it misses it, and everybody says, oh, it wasn't true. Well, epidemiological studies are so big, they're so involved, they're with humans, so there's no generalization from animals to man. Once you find it, you found it. And if other people don't find it, it's almost invariably due to flaws in their methodology. It's almost always realized. It took me a while to learn that, but now I realize it. And further studies, while desirable, it's part of the job of the science to say more research is needed. After all, that's what keeps the scientific establishment going. But we're forced to say it, even if we are not inclined to say it. If you submit a paper to a journal and it doesn't say that as the last sentence, it comes back with a big blue pen marking saying, state that more findings are needed, more research is needed, and so you're over a barrel, you're held by the throat as the author. You've got to add that line. So almost every study of almost everything ends with the line, more research is needed. Well, yeah, but we don't have to wait, while people are dying. Where's our sense of urgency? So we propose 3 plans of action. One is the Mary Lasker action. And in our own community, convince the doctors, at least the oncologists, to measure the 25-OHD in every cancer patient. If they can't get their lab to do it, get them to sign up for Grassroots Health, which will do it, for a very fair amount of money, and find out what it is, and then start repletion therapy. That would be 50,000 IU a day until they get up to 40 nanograms, and then somewhere between 2,000 and 8,000 IU a day after that. And if any of you know any cancer patient that hasn't been tested or isn't taking that much vitamin D, tell them to contact Grassroots Health. Next one is the Ramazzini action pattern, and this ultimately for the United States is to measure 25-OHD in every female, including girls, because that's where it's starting, and restore it to normal at all ages. that's going to be a big project, but it's just as important as measuring blood pressure or serum lipids. And then social action, which would include a nationwide real-time database for each cancer patient in the U.S. that if you get cancer, you're going to be in this database, and your vitamin D level is going to be in it, and your survival data is going to be in it, and you can reach it 24 hours a day and really get serious like we do with the space program about measurement. So I think I'll end with Angelina, and I just hope some of you are in a position to take action, and that we can get rid of this disease by 2020.